But yeah, thanks for sharing that. I actually would like to read more if there's a publication on that methodology. Was there a hand back here?
Yeah, and so it kind of feeds into that. And I was wondering if this accounts for historical events that occurred within this period of time that the research was done, just kind of like when you're selecting a jury and everyone's able to hear everybody else's story, right? That is definitely influencing the next person's response. So I'm wondering, when this research was done, were there any historical events accounted for, even within social media, of course, that would have affected these studies?
No, I don't think so. But the one thing that I would say though is that because they randomly assigned certain households to receive that conversation, it should just wash out in the end thanks to randomization. Is that a?
No, I thought you said the bathroom bill occurred in that.
Oh no, that was they actually showed an ad. So
okay.
these surveys were these re-interviews were done online. So one great thing with the internet is that you can reintroduce media. And so they embedded into some of those people taking the survey a campaign ad that had been used either in Houston or in other locations. So that way people had to consider this topic with that on their mind's eye, right?
In working in the mental health community with providers who self-identify as folks who discriminate, who have very overt blind spots and biases, one of the ways of providing support to them around being more non-discriminatory in the provision of mental health services is around looking at the notion of empathic failure. And one of the ways to get them in touch with their own empathic failure is consistently to look at ways in which there are some parallel events and experiences and reactivity in their own lives, and that is what creates the paradigm shift.
Yeah, I think empathy is a great word to use. I know Chris needs to talk, so what does the future hold? I looked into a crystal ball. Anyways, all I know is I just took those trend lines that we looked at before and said, okay, if we were to just extend that trend line, where should they go? And so 2018, this is the estimate for 2018, perhaps, if trends continue, which is always a big if. But if I were on the betting market, right, I would say that only 2 states in the South should have less than 50% in terms of support for marriage equality.
Which is?
So, which 2? Oh gosh.
Wasn't it Alabama was on the bottom of Mississippi?
Mississippi, Alabama, I'm pretty sure would be the ones that I would put there. So.
Maybe it isn't, but you don't just assume. They're not always.
They're not always, but anyways. I want to emphasize that it's hopeful, things are changing, we're in a time of change. So anyways, recap, I did these things. And thanks, we've had questions, I'm going to let Christy take over. Thank you.
Oh no, you're going to see it all before I start. Sorry. Okay. There we go. My name is Christy Mallory, and I'm a legal researcher at the Williams Institute. So now that you've heard about sort of the problems, the disparities that are facing LGBT people across the country, and particularly in the South, from Andrew and Brad, I'm going to talk about research that we've done to put in your hands in order to change that. So it's going to be kind of fast, so bear with me. You can always follow up with me after the presentation, and I can tell you how to find all of this online. All of the research I'm discussing here today is in one report or another on our website, so it's all very accessible. But that being said, please tell me if you need any clarification as I'm speaking or want to know more about a particular point or a particular study. So I have sort of 3 main topics I want to discuss today, and I'm going to focus mostly on employment discrimination as our issue of the day. It is an extremely important issue. It's one that's getting a lot of traction after now the marriage fight being over. A lot of people are turning to employment discrimination in particular, but also housing and public accommodations discrimination, which are two issues that have been raised sort of directly related to the marriage issue, particularly public accommodations as same-sex couples seek services as they plan their weddings and the discrimination that happens there. So even though I am focusing on employment today, the Williams Institute is doing a lot of great research in these other areas that'll be coming out in the next 6 months to a year. So stay tuned for that, particularly if you're interested in the religious freedom laws and housing discrimination. As I said, we're doing a lot of work on states eliminating by statute use of the gay and trans panic defense. So there's a lot more areas, but today we're going to focus on employment discrimination. So I want to talk about these three topics, which are research that shows a need for a non-discrimination law, and then the administrative impact of passing one of those. And then this is at the state level mostly, but the findings all translate to the local level as well. And if you're interested in campaigns at the local level, I can definitely sort of answer these questions, hopefully more on that level for you. And then I want to talk about the business impact of LGBT-supportive laws and policies, because that is another sort of issue that comes up as legislators are discussing these bills. And finally, the economic impact or the fiscal impact of these bills on the state. So to begin, I want to point out again, for those of you who weren't here when we started, I've done some fact sheets that are focused on all of the states in the South. We do our best to update those. We will be updating them. Some have come out a while ago now, but we're going to continue to put these together so that they are a brief set of talking points on basically an overview of LGBT people and their experiences in your state. We're also doing more in-depth dives into employment discrimination, as I said, and we have a series of reports that have come out, and I think they're now out in every state except for Tennessee and, what was the last one, Brad? Do you remember? Alabama? So those are coming if you're in one of those states. Otherwise, we have them online. So, focus states again. You don't need to see this map for the millionth time today. I'm flipped it around, so I'm going to look at the blue states where there's no protection from sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination. So let's talk about our research that shows a need for non-discrimination laws. So at the Williams Institute, we've actually spent several years sort of compiling these big research studies that bring together all kinds of different types of research that document discrimination against LGBT people. This started as part of a big project that we were doing that culminated in Brad presenting testimony before Congress on the Employment and Non-Discrimination Act back in 2009. Of course, now that's become broader than just employment, so that's part of the reason we're expanding our work as well. But we started to compile essentially this record of discrimination at the national level and have since been drilling down to individual state levels. So that's on this slide. And I want to talk about sort of different kinds of data that we have, including survey data, some findings from some controlled experiments that indicate employment discrimination is still happening to LGBT people, even at the stage where they are attempting to even get an interview to get their foot in the door. And some wage disparity studies that are a little bit different than what Brad showed. And then I want to talk about discrimination complaints filed with state enforcement agencies in court cases, complaints to community-based organizations and anecdotal reports. We won't get into all of this. It is all covered in the reports, but I'm trying to go sort of fast so we have time for questions. But yeah, that's where we're going to start. And so we saw this a little too. I just want to start with one sort of state topic, is how many people are in the workforce in each state. We have this data from the Gallup survey that Brad's presentation was based on. So we can actually break it down to the state level. It's the highest in DC at 10% of the workforce identifying as LGBT, and lowest in Louisiana at 3.2%. Or no, is that right? That doesn't look like 50 states to me, does it? I think I might have cut some states off of that. I think actually North Dakota is the lowest, to tell you the truth, at about 2%. Okay, so what do we know from survey data? This is from a study called the General Social Survey, run out of the University of Chicago, and it is a nationally representative survey. And on this survey, there was a module asking people whether they identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. There was not a question about gender identity or transgender status, so that is why I have said only LGBT here. It's important because that's what the survey asked. So we have here the data on experiences of discrimination, which was a related question in that module asking about LGBT status or LGB status on the survey. So this is showing people's experiences of discrimination or harassment within the last 5 years. It's broken down by different types of discrimination. And interestingly, we've also broken it down here by whether people say that they're out at work to their employers and their colleagues or whether they are not. You can see that discrimination is much higher among those who say that they are out at work. This is important for a lot of sort of new sort of research directions we are going because of the impact that fear of discrimination can have on people. If people think that people are more likely to be discriminated against when they're out, which looks like what the data shows, they might be afraid to come out at work, and they might spend considerable resources trying to keep their identity hidden. And that is a mental and physical drain on people, and they can't work to their full capacity at their jobs when they're worried about something like that. So that can have related health consequences, which is a new area of research we're going to be moving into, sort of looking at the cost of those health disparities because of this kind of thing, people having to stay closeted or fearing discrimination. Here's another big survey from the Pew survey that asked if LGBT, this is LGBT, I've made a point of putting the T there. The question was about LGBT respondents, and the question was whether they've been treated unfairly by an employer because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. This survey broke it down in a lifetime, over the lifetime, and then over the past year. So altogether, you're seeing 21% reporting that they've ever experienced discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity at work. So we've also done our best to gather all of the kinds of survey data that's been gathered and collected at the state level. So here is an example from South Carolina that their state equality group did several years ago now. But essentially surveying LGBT people, it's not a representative survey, and asking about their experiences of discrimination at work. Again, you see a high percentage of people reporting that they're not out about their sexual orientation and gender identity at work. And of course, we know now that this was not a representative sample. So to even get that survey, you assume that people are somewhat out and engaged to be interacting with the state equality group to the level that they're going to answer a survey. So I guess that among LGBT people generally in the state, that number would probably be a lot higher. Yes?
I have no idea about this, but is there any way to capture data around folks who are absolutely not out at work, but whose choices around their physical appearance sort of out them unintentionally or maybe intentionally, but they're not verbally out, but in the workforce there's an understanding, and they suffer abuse as a result of those presumptions, which are unlikely.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't seen a question like that unless the National Transgender Discrimination Survey includes something like that.
Yeah, part of what you're getting at is, I think there is some evidence in discrimination at work as well as experiences of discrimination and violence elsewhere. When you ask people about gender nonconformity and whether they perceive themselves to be gender nonconforming or they think other people perceive themselves.
Exactly.
And then you line that up, and even when you break down LGBT people in terms of either by self-perception or other people's perception, they're more gender nonconforming, they're the ones most likely to experience discrimination and violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what I've seen.
And then, might I just throw in one other thing, is that there's been social psychological research that also studies that you don't have to come out to somebody to be read as LGBT.
Exactly.
And they've done this with stick figures walking. And they just tell you the gender of the person. And just by looking at a stick figure, there's a high level of accuracy in guessing somebody's sexual orientation. So, and that's actually done out of UCLA. I actually walked on one of those. I walked on one of those treadmills.
And another place you can see it, although it's not a survey, and I don't know of any representative surveys that ask questions at that level of detail, but maybe you do. But is oftentimes when we gather anecdotal reports from the media or complaints to legal organizations where people actually have to get into the circumstances and facts related to the discrimination that took place, you can kind of pull out that kind of information and look at it that way.
Thank you.
So, sure. To keep moving along speedily, the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, this is data from the 2010 survey. They now have a new one, and one of our colleagues, Jody Herman, is in the process of helping them clean and report all of that data now, so look forward to that. But back in 2010, when the first wave was done, they had large enough sample sizes to do state-level estimates in a number of states, and I think I heard that they hope this year to have enough people nationwide to do statewide estimates. That'll be based on whether there's enough people in each state answering the question. So here you can see reports from North Carolina and Texas. Again, to compare these to LGBT overall, much higher levels of discrimination when you look at only transgender respondents. And this is pretty consistent for all of their state level reports, whether or not the state has a state law actually. So now I want to talk a little bit about wage disparities. What do we see? So this is from census data. Again, as Brad said, census only can measure whether you are in a same-sex couple and cohabitating with that person. It cannot measure LGBT status because there's no demographic question like that on the census. Yeah. So we see here that men in same-sex partnerships earn less than men who are married to different sex partners. Interestingly, you do see what we call the lesbian advantage in this sort of data world. But of course, as you probably expect, women across the board are earning less than men. And this is a pretty consistent pattern too across all the states. So then we also looked at some controlled experiments and field studies, particularly studies where matched resumes are sent to employers, and they track whether LGBT respondents are as likely as non-LGBT respondents to get a call back for an interview. So again, this is discrimination before we even usually think of the point at which discrimination starts to happen, which is when somebody's already in the workplace. So this is even about getting that first call back, which is often legally challenging to prove because you aren't sure who's getting called back. You're not in an environment where you can tell if you're being treated differently. So you can see that in 8 out of 9 recent studies, they did find evidence of discrimination as the matched resumes were sent out, and they looked for callbacks among the employers. A scholar that's now affiliated with us is preparing a study right now to do this with gender identity. These were sort of broader. There were both men and women included, and there was like a sexual orientation code, but there's nothing that's been like gender identity specific, something to out them as transgender on their resume. So then in these state level reports that we've been doing, we also include a discussion of existing protections in the state and try to bring all of that together, and then we are able to use population and workforce data from the census to estimate the portion of the population and portion of the workforce in each state that does have protections and those that don't. You can see huge variations here. In the southern states, Florida, I believe, has the highest by a lot in the southern states because they have so many local ordinances. North Carolina is very low. Louisiana is very low. Okay, then sort of the second half of our non-discrimination reports is looking at what is this going to cost the state if we add sexual orientation and gender identity to our existing non-discrimination laws. As you can imagine, that is a claim that comes up still quite often in the legislature as they have to do analyses of these bills and state impacts and whether people really are concerned about the costs or that's being used because they don't want to say I'm homophobic and transphobic, so we don't want to pass a law because it'll cost the government money. It does come up either way. So this is an analysis that we just recently did at the Institute based on 2 previous studies that were done over the last 15 years, also at the Institute. And essentially what we did is we gathered complaints from administrative agencies that are tasked with enforcing non-discrimination laws in all of the states that prohibit sexual orientation discrimination. So we brought in the complaints based on race, sex, and sexual orientation and gender identity. And then we sort of measured them by the population of each state to put them into context, because we know there are very few LGBT people in a state compared to women and people of color. So if you look at the raw number of complaints, it looks like there's very few complaints of sexual orientation. So part of that argument was, oh, there's no complaints, so why should we add this to the law? The other side of it, as I just mentioned, is the flood argument. Oh, if we pass the law, there's going to be all these complaints filed. So this study actually addresses both points simultaneously. So we gather the complaints, low raw numbers. Then we put it into, we do the per capita measurement by saying how many complaints are filed on each basis per 10,000 people with the characteristic who are most likely to be discriminated against. So for sexual orientation and gender identity complaints, we measured against LGBT people. For race complaints, we measured against people of color. And for sex complaints, we measured against the population or the workforce of women in each state. So you see there that when we adjust by the population most likely to file each type of complaint, the rates are very similar across the board. So this essentially says LGBT people are as likely as people of color and women to file these types of complaints. I've also done it with housing and public accommodations. We don't have time to get into it, so I encourage you to look at it on the website. So now I want to discuss briefly the business impact of LGBT supportive policies. This comes up a lot too, and has been recently as people are sort of making these broader appeals, just sort of reasons why non-discrimination protections or even broader equality laws should be passed. So we did a study recently at the Williams Institute where we looked at the reasons that the top 50 federal contractors and the top 50 Fortune 1000 companies have adopted their own internal non-discrimination policies. So we looked through their own press statements, we looked through media reports, we looked through court cases where it came up there, we looked for anything that we could find where the company said, this is why we enacted a particular policy. And so we did it for non-discrimination policies broadly, as I said, and then LGBT specific. We also did benefits policies, but I don't have that here. So we found that 92% of the companies had cited some kind of economic motive for adopting these policies, the broad non-discrimination policies, and 53% of the companies that said there was some economic reason actually linked the sexual orientation and gender identity component of the policies to some kind of economic benefit. So you're probably asking what is an economic benefit that they're citing, and I went through all of their statements and pulled out the economic benefits that they were mentioning. And this is actually a representative word cloud kind of thing, so recruitment and retention was mentioned far more often than any other benefit, but you can see others reflected there, to improve employee productivity, to improve employee relations and morale, to improve customer service. You get the idea. So then we looked at, we wanted to figure out, okay, so the companies are saying this, but what does that actually mean is happening to the company when they pass these non-discrimination policies? So to try to get an idea of how it was playing out in the real world, we consulted academic studies that have tried to figure out if there actually is this economic benefit that companies sort of say there is. So we identified, oh gosh, I think it was 50-something studies that have tried to assess whether there is an impact of LGBT-specific non-discrimination policies on a company. And this is basically what we found. So all of the studies are represented here, and we represented findings whether they were positive or neutral or negative. So you can see the blue line, the dark blue line on the right is studies that found a positive business relationship to the particular economic outcome listed and the LGBT policy. And then there's a few neutral and a few found negative relationships, but overall you can see the vast majority found that that these policies were actually having these impacts on the employers. Finally, I'll just talk for a minute about the sort of studies we're doing about the fiscal impact of non-discrimination policies or not having a policy. And so Jody Herman, who works with us, has been doing some of these studies looking particularly at the cost of not having a gender identity non-discrimination law, again, because we do have better data on transgender people because of the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. So she's been able to use that to figure out how much states are basically spending in means-tested benefits because of discrimination. So you can see here she did an analysis for Florida, an analysis for New York. Florida is about Medicaid expenditures because of employment discrimination and how much more states are spending on Medicaid for these people that would otherwise have insurance through their employer. And then employment and discrimination and housing discrimination were both studied in the New York study. So you can find that they're pretty sizable impacts, especially in New York. She estimates $1.5 to $7 million a year because they didn't, this was at the time that there were no gender identity protections. Now, as Brad said, there's been a governor's order to interpret the sex non-discrimination protections to prohibit discrimination based on gender identity, but this time that wasn't there either. So we're going to be doing more of this. As I said, we're going to be looking at health impacts as well. That's all I have. I think I have just in time.
Great, and we're at time. As I said at the beginning, you can go to our website and find the interactive and all the data that we have. Christy is our state and local coordinator, so if you need any research, and if you didn't see them already, there are state fact sheets over here. We brought 4 or 5 for each state, so all of you from North Carolina will have to share. But these are all available online as well. There's a map of the United States on our homepage, and if you click on your state, it'll pull up all the state-specific research we've done for your state. Thank you.